Hey everyone, welcome to the Podcast Expansion Network, your go-to destination for insider tips and success stories in podcast growth. I'm your host, Victor Dwyer, and today we're joined by Gary Bird, founder of SMC National, a marketing powerhouse with over $20 million in revenue. Gary, thank you so much for joining today. Please give the audience that hasn't heard of you yet a little intro about who you are and how you got started into the world of podcasts.
Absolutely. My name's Gary Bird. I'm the founder of SMC National. We are a growth partner for dental practices, and we help them create, convert, and close more new patients so they can grow the way that they want. And one of the things that has been very, very successful for us is doing podcasts. Podcasting to me at first was just a way to network with people. So I could basically meet people when I wanted to meet with them. But then I started to realize that it was also a way to build credibility, and being on these podcasts with these folks really leveled up my credibility in the dental industry. And then now we have a pretty big following of people who watch our podcast. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't hear somebody say, I saw you on a podcast. Or when I go to a live event in the dental industry, people are like, I listen to you all the time. I feel like I know you. So there's a lot of benefits to podcasting. That's kind of a quick synopsis of why we got into podcasting.
That's amazing. And obviously, you see the benefits afterward. Like when people start knowing you, you start realizing, oh my gosh, this works. But there's obviously a big, long threshold of kind of like that curve of how it grows, like where it starts out at 1 and then it goes to 2 and it at the very beginning, it's very, very slow. And then obviously gets larger in results. What do you think has been the biggest, success, I guess, when it comes down to growing your podcast and making it successful?
It really is just about getting the right people on and talking about it, to be honest with you. Like if you're bringing, so here's a couple things. So who's our audience? Who are we speaking to? Are we speaking to people who have podcasts or thinking about podcasts? My answer would be a little bit different depending on who's listening to us right now.
It would be the people that have a podcast and that are looking to grow it.
Okay. So somebody who already has a podcast, what I would recommend to grow it more is figure out who your audience is and who they already respect. So there's a respect transfer that happens, right? So when I bring somebody on that already has a respect of a certain group of people and I get them on my podcast, that allows me to transfer that trust and respect over to me. And that instantly gets you your foot in the door with that group of people who follow that person. So that's how I kind of think of it, is getting an opportunity with a group of people you normally wouldn't be able to get your foot in the door with. And the more you do that, if you do that week after week, day after day, that really starts to expand how people know you. It's very similar to social media, right? Like if you get the right picture with the right person and they tag you or they repost you can get a lot of traction with that. And podcasting is very similar in that way. So that's one. The other thing for growth is consistency. You have to stick with it. If you stop, you lose it all, right? And so you just have to decide, I'm going to do this for the next several years and I'm going to do it every single week. The other thing that's really helped me with growth is I don't have to do any of the back end anything. I literally take 10 minutes to prep and then I film. So, and in my filming, I've gotten it down to 30 minutes. I do 20-minute episodes. So I'm always looking at ways to have my team help me find guests, my team help me process the podcast, process the prep, like everything. Like just do it so that way you can do as many podcasts as possible. I do about 5 podcasts a week. So that's something that's really helpful as well. Volume it gets you more viewers, obviously.
Yeah, can you go into a little bit about the balance? The 5 is a lot. I haven't heard someone say 5 yet. I have heard 2, like 2 a week, 3 a week, and things like that. Obviously, there's a balance between quality and quantity when it comes down to it. How do you reach that threshold of that quality and quantity of podcasts per week?
Well, so one of the things was I was like, man, and I think this goes through a lot of people's heads. Am I going to have enough to talk about? Right. And really, honestly, you feel like a broken record. You feel like you're saying the same thing over and over and over again. And that was a big fear for me. But then what I did is I make it all about the guest. So when I bring a guest on, I'm there to learn about them and learn about what they do and learn from them. So I'm really just learning, but in exchange, what's happening is my audience is learning as well. And so you have to be vulnerable and ask the dumb question, right? Like you don't want to sound dumb, but you have to ask the dumb question. Like, I don't know this. What does that mean? What you just use an acronym. I don't know what that acronym means. I guarantee there's people in your audience that are going to want to learn that as well. So that's how I approach it. And what that does is gives me endless content. Pressure isn't on me to create the content. The pressure is on the guest. And as long as they're good at what they do, then people are going to find find it interesting. So really the question becomes not how do I keep making content? It's how do I keep finding the right kind of guests that are going to make good content for me?
And how do you gauge whether if this person is going to be a good guest or a bad guest?
If they have any experience in what they do. So the more experience they have, the more I'm going to be able to learn from them. So there's levels to success, right? So there's like the person
Mhm.
who owns one business. There's a person who owns multiple businesses. There's the person who is a thousandaire. There's a person who's a millionaire. There's a person who's a billionaire, right? Like
Yeah.
getting those levels. This is true in every industry, right? So getting the
Mhm.
levels of people and moving up the ladder. So the bigger the people I get, the more I get the next opportunity at the bigger person. And that really, really helps me have that credibility instantly transferred over. And so if they have experience, they're going to be able to talk about it. And so that really the only bad guest I've ever had are like people who don't have experience, and they kind of tricked me into that they did have experience. And that makes for a rough rodeo, but even those people I've figured out a way to like kind of talk through it. But those shows typically don't do as good. The shows that do the best are the ones that have the most experience and the most credibility already built up, and that's in their little sector of whatever that is. And again, it makes it super easy to make content.
So it sounds like, to answer the question of quantity versus quality, it sounds like it just comes down to guests.
For
Really, like
me,
the amount of guests
for
that you
me,
can get
yes.
on, unique, valuable guests, that determines the quality of the episodes and the quantity by how many of the quality guests you get, really.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's like, okay, well, what kind of questions I'm going to ask? So I have different questions that I ask. So on one of my shows, I ask, how'd you get into the dental industry? And that's our whole conversation is around that. The other two are like specialty inside of dental, like specific topics of kinds of dentistry. And so I ask, how are you growing in that area right now? Like, what's the number one thing that you're seeing growth around in this area? So that's basically I've my whole thing. I just have to know a little bit about the guest, and then I'm going to ask that question, and then I let them talk, and then I ask questions around like, well, how'd you do that? Like, I don't wait. What do you mean? I just had a doctor on that was like very technical, and I was like, I don't know what that means. Like, explain that to me. And again, I'm most of my listeners are dentists, so maybe they knew it, maybe they didn't, but they're learning by osmosis through me because I'm willing to ask the stupid question.
That's amazing. And then, so we talked about the podcast side on growing the long form, but a lot of people end up getting the traction through the short form content on social media. Do you have a strategy in place to help produce more short form content, which is like those like social media snippets from your podcast episode? Can you go into a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I've done that before. They didn't get as many views. I have a couple
Mhm.
views. I have a couple videos that did really, really well, but for the most part, it became a lot. And I did it for many, many years. The reason I kept doing it is there is value in, for me, this is for me. I'm sure other people have different experiences, right? But you got to keep in mind I'm in dental. So it's not like our topics are like, oh, everybody wants to listen to this. The algorithm's like, no, actually, no one cares about this. So, what I did find value in clips for the podcast for a while, the guest felt really special being on those clips, right? And so now I did try like different things. So I would try like, let's talk about topics that are non-dental related. So that way we can get the algorithm really to click in. But it was just really then it became an uncomfortable podcast because now I'm making the podcast more for clips than for the podcast. So I do a ton now of clips for my company and for myself outside of the podcast that then drive back to the podcast eventually. But yeah, I don't, the clips as a whole was not a strategy that worked really well because of the niche that we were so niche down. We're not just in dental. We're like, we serve like 5% of dental, and dental's already you have the healthcare industry, which is a niche. Then you have dental inside of healthcare. There's only like 200,000 dental offices in the United States or somewhere around there. And then we only serve about 5 or 10% of that market from there. So
Wow.
we're like niche on top of niche on top of niche on top of niche.
Got it. So it sounds like you're creating the clips itself directly without the podcast and just making the short form yourself. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And like there's pros and cons of that. The pros are that like obviously you tailor make it so that way it's like that short form is going, you already know, if you already have knowledge on what short form works the best, you can create it based off of that. But obviously the problem is the scale, like where you won't be able to like do 100, like you won't be able to make 100 clips out of one podcast, for example, using
Exactly.
that method.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's much harder to scale. but it's much more tailored. Now, if I was doing a podcast about cryptocurrency, or I was doing a podcast about like sports medicine, or I was doing a podcast about stuff like that, then I would do it. The other thing to keep in mind here too, I could do a podcast about like dental health and then have dentists come on and talk about dental health, and then people could potentially watch that. But a lot of dentists there's a lot of controversy around that, right? And I've made videos about that before and they've gone viral, and I've had to pull them down because it ticks off half of the potential customers that I want to work with, right? So dental as a whole is not agreed on what is good treatment and bad treatment, stuff like that. It's actually very
So I want to
polarizing.
go into like you're obviously in a very, very tight niche. So can you explain to someone that's trying to grow an audience? Obviously, there's a balance of niching down. Obviously, you don't want to have a too general or too specific audience. Like whereas like not just starting a football podcast, starting the Dallas Cowboy podcast. And obviously you can even make a subset of that of like Dallas Cowboys suck podcast. Like there's a lot of like niching down that you can do. Obviously you want to have one other person, like a big enough niche to where there's more than one other person than you out there for sure. And obviously don't want to do too general. Can you go into a little bit about the differences between niching down too specific or too broad and go into a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the number one thing here is that I am not a podcaster, right? Like I do podcasting because I run a business, and this is something that I had to learn how to do. I think a lot of people who go out just to start podcasting as the first thing and then try to create a business behind that, you can do that, and people have done that, but it's super hard. It's like making the NBA, right? Like that, the number of podcasts that are out there versus the you making it is probably similar to the numbers of making the NBA or making the NFL. Like you can be really good, but the chances of actual success like at a high level is going to be very, very low. And think about it. There's famous people who start podcasts and fail, that have followings, and like people are like, dude, I don't care. So I think that's the difference. For me, I don't need 20,000 people to listen to my podcast. I'll be really happy with a couple thousand people listening to my podcast. I'm good with that, right? So I have a business that funds the podcast, and then so I have a business, I make money at it, then I create a podcast that pays for that, so I don't need to have huge numbers, and then the podcast itself becomes my advertisement because I can put ads in the podcast for myself, so I don't have to have sponsors and all those kind of things. So that's how I think through it from a niche standpoint. I personally believe like be super niche, but if you're going to be super niche, you better have a business that supports it. If I was just starting a podcast, I would not start it like around dental or anything. Like I would definitely do something I was super passionate about. And then, man, I don't even know like how I would blow that up. I've never even gone down that road. So I feel bad. If someone wants to go down that road, it's a very tough road. I can see how hard that would be.
So normally when I recommend someone starting a podcast, I usually say go into the curiosity of like what makes them curious, so that way they're actually motivated to create the podcast and like make it successful. So it sounds like that it's almost like taking what you're curious about and then making a business successful and having a business structure, like learning the business structure behind it, and then using the podcast from there as a marketing channel to grow that business is kind of what I'm hearing. So rather than going curiosity to podcast, it sounds more like curiosity business than podcast is what I'm hearing. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't start a business around curiosity because I'm curious about a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that they're good businesses, right? So
Yeah.
for me, it's what problem are you solving? How big of a problem are you solving? The bigger the problem that you're solving, the harder it's going to be, but the more money you have if you solve it. So if you learn, if the problem that you solve is making a hamburger, it's like, well, that's not a big problem. Lots of people can do that. That's not going to be a huge payout necessarily, right? If you're the problem that you're solving is cancer, that is a huge payout. Huge if you get there, but it's super hard. You're not the first person that's ever tried to solve that problem, right? So the size of the problem that you solve is going to be the payout on the business from a business standpoint. That doesn't mean you're going to love it though. As far as loving it, yes, being curious, being passionate about it, caring about it, that's really, really important. But I have found that those things wear off. For me, it's the journey. I enjoy the entrepreneurial journey of building things, building a podcast, building a company, building LMSs, learning how to do different things. So that for me is exciting. So I get fulfillment out of that side of it over long periods of time. And then I get bored of stuff. And then I'm okay, what's the next thing that I'm going to learn how to do? So that's how I think through it, is figure that out first and then build the business. And then once you have money, then build the podcast and have the business supported from that angle. if that makes sense.
That does. And that does free up some funds already on being able to build out a team to help you be successful, where you can like start out with like one person running it and then going that direction, rather than like when you just start out with the podcast. Let's say if it takes 4 to 5 years to make that podcast successful, that's going to be 4 or 5 years of constantly doing every single part of the
Yeah.
podcast, and you're going to naturally hate and hate the things that like all the pieces of like, sometimes you might like the social media side but hate the video editing side, or love the video
Yeah.
editing side but hate the social media side.
Yep.
And so
And that's how
there's
all
just a
business
lot.
is. That's how all
Yeah.
business is. When you start a business and you're the only one doing it, there's parts that you love. So you might love the sales and the marketing part of it, but you might hate the HR and the bookkeeping part of it. You know what I mean? So anytime you start a business, that's the way it's going to be. You're going to love some parts, hate other parts. And if podcasting is the business, yes, most definitely you are going to hate it. Like if I had to edit videos, I'd rather do anything else besides edit a video. I do not care. Could I learn how to edit a video? Sure, I could learn how to do that. I hate it. I hate proofing newsletters, you know what I mean? And reading through and trying to find where we work better there. There's so many other things I'd rather do with my time. And so you're 100% spot on that.
Cool. And then what are some common mistakes that you went through when starting your podcast and trying to make it successful that you would encourage other people to fix in the future?
Yeah, going into it, I just really put myself in a mindset, and I'm thankful I did. And if I was going to do it over, I'd do the same thing again. I don't care. No one's going to watch this. I'm just going to create. It serves me so well in every single area. Content. So social media content. Now, here's the thing. You have to really not care. And most people say, no, I don't care. I don't care what people think. Liar. You do care what people think. Everybody cares what people think. You have to get over that. And you have to start creating, and you have to do it quickly. So my first podcast looked horrible. The sound was horrible. I tried to get everything right, but it just wasn't right. And I just didn't care. Like I really kept telling myself I didn't care. So kind of my journey, and this is one thing that's also served me well, is that every year I try to do something that I'm super uncomfortable doing, like really uncomfortable. So first year was I'm going to post 3 times a day. I'm going to post videos every single day, 3 times a day, even if I don't have anything to say. And I did that for a year. I got decent at talking on camera, right? I got comfortable with it at least. And I had to overcome like, man, what are they going to think about this? And I started on TikTok, just posting there. I almost have 100,000 followers on there now. And so not like, I know there's people with way more followers than that. But for me, it was just me doing it. No one was helping me. I was just talking to a camera. And then from there, the next thing I did is I said, I'm going to start a podcast. And that was super scary. I was like, dude, what am I going to talk about? All those kind of things. The next thing was I'm going to host an in-person event. I did that. Then I'm going to host multiple in-person events. Then it was virtual events, and then so on and so forth, right? Now, this year, 2024, that we're having this conversation is creating LMSs, learning management systems, where I'm taking and learning the whole process of something, putting that into a system. So that's the thing that I pushed myself to do this year. So all of those had to happen before the thing to happen next, right? So I had to do all of those. Were doing those in order. So it's just like biggest mistake is doing what you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable doing it, it's not big enough, especially if you're trying to do big things, right? If you're like, I want to be the greatest, then you're going to be super uncomfortable all the time. So that's number one. Number two is like, you have to really, if you're going to do anything at scale, you literally have to not care what people have to say about it. You have to have conviction about it and just do it. So mistake number two is not having conviction about and just pushing through that. And if you can do those two things, the rest of it, the technical, how am I going to set up my video? How am I going to get my sound right? How am I going to publish it? How am I going to create the clips? How am I going to do all these things? You can do all those things. Like most people you can go on YouTube and go figure those things out. It's the mindset stuff that you can't go to YouTube to go figure out. And that for me is the biggest thing. And once you get that down, the rest of it is just getting reps in. There's tons of people online that talk about this. Like you just have to do a lot of it, do more of it, do wherever you're at now, do 5 times, 10 times more. And then you're going to be comfortable with it where it's not a big deal.
Yeah. But there's also a balance of like not caring what the audience thinks, and then also like taking those critiques to optimize it and like see what works at the same time. So there's a balance of like saying, hey, like I'm not going to take these critiques personally, but at the same time of taking them, like listening enough to help on the next iterations to make your content better over time as well. Can you go
It
into a little
depends
bit what
though.
that balance
It
looks like?
depends. Like, well, it depends, right? So, like on social media, you have to be polarizing if you want your videos to go. If you say something that everybody agrees with, no one's going to watch your video. You have to say
True.
things that some people agree with and a lot of people don't agree with. Right now, my most popular videos have angry people in the comments saying, "This is stupid," da 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 da, right? Like it's polar, and it's not. And here's the other thing. Like for me, there's certain, when I say like not caring what people think, like for me, there's certain things I am not going to do online. There's certain things I'm not going to carry myself a certain way. I'm not going to say certain things. I'm not going to do dances and things like I do not care. If you were like, I'll give you 20 billion views if you do this, it's like, no, bro, I'm not doing that. I do not care to do that. Like, I do not want to be perceived through that light. And then there's other things that I am willing to do. So when I say not caring what people think, like, until you have a video go viral, when I say viral, I mean like 5 to 10 million views. Like I've never been called more names in one place at one time before, right? Like until you've experienced that, and at first it stinks. Like I'll be honest with you, the first time it happened where I was like, oh, this video's doing great, and then I start reading through the comments and they're like, this guy's an idiot, he has no, and I'm just like, dude, okay. And it kind of hurts at first, and then now I'm just like, this is just part of business. Anytime that 5 million people see you, there's going to be a large percentage of them do not like you for things that I've had people talk about: the way I look, the way I talk. There's people in the comments of my videos right now that are like, this guy clearly has never done anything in business before. And I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? So it's just like,
Yeah.
you just have to take it with a grain of salt. But at the same time, I realize what you're saying as well is like, you have to be able to take feedback. But see, I only take feedback from people I respect their opinions. So I don't take feedback I've had to learn to not take feedback from people that I do not know and I do not respect. So if you're like, hey, Gary, I know you, right? And I know you're running a successful business or podcast, then yes, not only do I want your feedback, I value your feedback. But if you're a dude just in my Instagram feed, just being like, or my YouTube feed, just saying crazy stuff, I have to not care, or else I'm going to care too much and I'm going to have depression, you know what I mean? Or something like that. So
Mhm.
I think it's not a balancing act. It's a definition problem that we run into when you start to do things at scale.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then you have to add, like, that's where it goes to, like, what is your purpose? Like when it
Yeah.
comes down to either the podcast or your business, of like, if your goal, obviously, if your goal is a sports podcast or something and creating that controversy, that might be good for you. But
Yeah.
in most businesses, you just want to create awareness of providing value, depending on what type of business you're in. You might be in the business of where controversy is important and you might get into that. But for most businesses that are starting a podcast and things like that, their goal is going to be to start like just to provide value and insights to teach people, then gain their trust and go from there, is how
Well,
most people are going to usually build up their podcasts.
yeah, so I would challenge that and I would say, well, why should I listen to you and not the other 40 people who are giving financial advice? Like, what makes you different?
Mm-hmm.
Something has to make you different. Like, there's so much noise out there right now. So, what is different about you? What is different about your approach than everybody else's? And that's what's going to really make people want to listen to you. And then that's what builds your tribe, right? So, like, when people bump into me, they're like, they know me as Gary, the marketing guy. And here's my polarizing thing: dental marketing agencies are dead. They're dead. And it's like, whoa, what does that mean? Well, we're a growth partner. Well, what does that mean, Gary? Right. And now I got you. Now this is like, I just said, oh, yeah. All those other competitors that you would deem competitors to me. Oh, no, that whole industry is dead. It's dead. And I'm a growth partner. Well, what does that mean exactly? Right. And that's going to last for like 3-4 years. And then everybody's going to be a growth partner. And then it's like, okay, well, what's the next thing that makes you different? What's different? And what's going to make people that keep asking, why? Why do you feel that way? And what is that? That's kind of how I think through it.
Yeah, and that goes for business and podcasts. Like, I feel like you like starting when you're starting that business of that unique factor of like, why should someone pay you? And then also, why should someone listen to your podcast as well? I think they're twofold in that.
Yep. 100% agree.
And they might, like, the podcast and business might have different unique factors as well. Like, you might have like a podcast agency that you might have like amazing processes and things like that. And you could start a podcast of like why those processes are amazing. That's totally optional. Or like you can build your podcast around another unique fact, being like hilarious or like whatever on the podcast, or having
Yeah.
this crazy personality or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But
You
that
could be
unique factor
funny.
is
You could
really
use
important.
humor. You could use humor to grow your social media and your podcast, but you might be an attorney. You know what I mean? Like, that's not funny at all. Like, people are going to jail. Like, I've seen people do that. And it's like, that's totally fine to do that. You can do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then what other strategies have you been doing to grow? Do you ever do like an email newsletter that ties to your podcast? Are there any other external channels that you like kind of tie to your podcast together?
Yeah, we do. We do all of that stuff. Like we email out the podcast, and we just try to. What I try to do, the main thing that I try to do is take my guest and really highlight them, and then have them
Mhm.
share it. If they're sharing it and putting it out there, and then if you work with somebody who works for somebody. So if I can get somebody to come on who's a guest who works for a big company and they'll promote it, that's huge. You know what I mean? That's those shows always do really well. The other thing that does really well is like end of year podcast. So every time we reach, a calendar year and we've done 52 episodes, we do the best of, and then we tag everybody in those posts and tag all, like, here's the best performing podcasts of this year. So you take your 52 podcasts, you look at which ones did the best that year. So maybe there's 12 of them, and then do clips of those. And you say, these are the best performing parts of those best performing ones. And then you tag all those people. Those always do really well as well. And now you're getting back in front of all those people's audiences again, and you're crossing the audiences. So there a lot of things can happen with that as well from a growth standpoint.
And where is your community? So like, since you don't use a lot of like the posting to the clips itself, because like that's where sometimes their community can be like gathered almost, like they could be on like TikTok, Facebook groups, like things like that. It sounds like you sort of have an email newsletter strategy. Where is your community normally at? Is it mainly on these audio podcast platforms?
Dentists love learning. So that's one thing dentists love learning, and they love information. And they're very analytical, like very, very analytical, like very close to accountants, right? That would probably be the closest industry from a brain or mindset. So yeah, so the dentists love podcasts. They listen to them, they consume them, they love newsletters. They also love webinars, and they get things like that. So yeah, we do a ton of that kind of stuff. And then we have Facebook groups and stuff that we manage as well. So that's where dentists learn. And then they also go to events, in-person events as well.
So I'm wondering, like, what is the most successful that you've seen? Like, for example, if I'm a dentist, where am I going to get my notification most likely? Hey, Gary just opened up a new episode. Are they getting this on
Apple.
Spotify?
No,
Are they
Apple.
getting it through
It's
the
like
Facebook group?
80%, 80, 90% Apple podcasts.
Apple Podcasts. Really? Wow. That's huge. That's huge. Is that because just most people use Apple Podcasts?
I have no idea. I haven't been able to
Okay.
figure that out, why everybody listens there. That's where all the repeat listeners, like almost all, 80 to 90% are going to be through Apple Podcasts. Spotify's probably second, and then all the other stragglers in there.
Wow. That's huge. Yeah, that's the first time I've heard that big of a percentage before.
Yeah.
So that could be huge if someone's not on Apple Podcasts right now.
Oh yeah, I don't know why
Wow.
you wouldn't be on Apple Podcasts. Yeah. Wait, do people not on Apple Podcasts? Like, how would you?
Sometimes people like only publish to Spotify where they
And
just
they share
upload
that
it
link.
directly to Spotify. I don't use the other, like the Buzzsprouts of the world or anything else like that.
Got
But
it.
yeah, you should definitely be uploading to those
Everywhere.
like
Yeah.
distribution platforms for sure,
Yeah.
to get on
100%.
the rest of the platforms.
Totally agree.
And is there anything else that we mentioned? It could have been any of the other conversations talking about podcasts, businesses, anything else that you want to touch on or put more thought into?
No, I think we did a good job. We did a good job kind of covering everything.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. Can you please tell the audience of how to find more about you, how to find more about your podcast and everything else there?
Yeah, just go to the Gary Bird, just GaryBird.com, thegarybird.com. And that's all my social media handles. I create it, and people are going to listen to this and be like, how bored would I have to be to go listen to a dental podcast? They're extremely boring. Probably the boringest podcast out there that you could possibly listen to. So don't come listen to my podcast. If you're in the dental industry, come listen to it. If you're not in the dental industry, you're going to hate it. But all my content on social media, I don't make it about dental on purpose. Like every once in a while, I'll talk about dental or work it in there. But a lot of my stuff's around like inflation and around like economic things. Like I have a video right now that went viral. Is like, how much does it actually cost to make a Starbucks coffee? That has like several million views across multiple platforms. So follow me on Instagram, TikTok, all those platforms. Would love your follow, and I interact a lot on there. So would love to interact with you and your audience.
Yeah. And you don't make that for your business, right? Like, what's your purpose for making that content?
I have a
I'm just curious.
personal brand. Yeah, I'm just trying to build my
Personal brand.
personal brand. Yeah, personal brand, company brand, two different things. So the company brand is all dental focused. My personal brand is probably 80% not dental focused, and 20% I work in like awards that I get in the dental industry and stuff like that. And the reason I do that is it's really hard. I tried growing my personal brand with all dental content. Really, really hard. Very difficult.
Okay, that's smart. That's smart. Usually people integrate the two, so that's really interesting that you keep them separated. But that's probably just
Personal
because of
and
how
business
niche
brand.
down you are.
Personal brand, everybody should build a personal brand, and it should be separate from your business. The most
Mhm.
successful businesses in the world right now have personal brands tied to them, and that's why they're successful. Elon Musk is, we know Tesla because we know Elon Musk. If Elon Musk sold Tesla tomorrow, our opinions would all change of the company. And so Twitter, same. And I know there's a lot of negativity around Twitter, but Twitter is Elon Musk. SpaceX is Elon Musk. He's a personal brand. And so I think that in the future, you're going to see more and more personal brands that represent companies. And here's the honest truth. To grow a Facebook page, to grow a Instagram page, any of those kind of things, no one really cares to follow a business. I don't really follow businesses. And when I do, I don't interact with their content, but I do interact with people. And so if you can tie a person to a business, you get a lot more flexibility, and you can also pivot. And this is true whether you work for somebody else or you run your own business. If you start building your personal brand, you can use, it's a calling card that I can open up 20 businesses tomorrow and use my personal brand to promote all of them and tie them in somehow.
So, question about when you start the podcast, obviously you're doing under the podcast name, not the business name. Is that
Correct. Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. So my company's name is SMC National. The podcast name is Dental Marketing Theory. And then I'm the Gary Bird, who happens to host the podcast and who also happens to run the marketing company, but they're all three separate entities that are tied together.
Got you. So for anyone, if you were starting a new company tomorrow, you basically recommend starting, like, basically having that company, having a separate podcast name within the same industry, and then having some type of personal brand that is separated from all of those things, but building up some type of personal brand on
It
the
depends
side
what
as
your
well.
goals are. It depends what your goals are. So if you're just like, hey, I own a food truck and I just want to own one food truck my whole life, and that's all I ever want to do, and I don't ever want to sell it, then cool, make it all one thing. Make it the Gary Bird food truck, right? And that's totally fine. And you can tie it all together. The problem is if you are building a business and if you ever plan to not run that business, or you plan to sell that business, or you plan on opening up other businesses, once you start mashing everything together, it's very hard to untangle that. Very, very difficult.
The main obstacle I have when it comes to the personal brand, obviously we're both business owners and things like that. How do you find the priority? It's real, like, I technically have the time. It's just the priority. I always prioritize my business in the to-do list there. How do you prioritize the personal brand to make sure that saying, hey, this is going to be important, I need to invest this time in the future, rather than like necessarily investing that on my business? How do you prioritize the two?
That's a good question. So number one, again, remember I got help. So I
Mhm.
don't put a ton of time into any of it from a calendar standpoint. For me, on my personal brand, I just film stuff that I want to film. Like that's it. And then I'm like, okay, well, how do I make the stuff that I want to talk about go viral? And then I just work on
Mhm.
that. Like, so for me, it's not like a chore. The other thing, like I have to film. So my podcasts are really simple. Like they get on my calendar. I have somebody else who finds the guest, somebody else who processes the guest, someone else who preps the guest. I do 10 minutes of prep before the podcast. Then I film and ask the questions. That's 30 minutes. And then somebody else edits, posts,
Mhm.
promotes the whole 9 yards, right? The whole thing. So I'm spending each podcast, I spend a maximum of 40 minutes on. That's it. That's all I
Interesting.
do. Yeah. I don't put a ton of time into those other things. And then with filming content, I film content once a week for my personal brand. Once a week, I do it with my son. So he grabs the phone and the microphone. So it's like spending time with my kid, and he's 17. So I'm like, okay. And then somebody else preps all the ideas. So I have like the big picture ideas. Somebody else is like, okay, do it this way. They script it out. I give it to my son. My son preps the shoot. He goes, okay, here's where we're going today. We got to get these 3 videos filmed. We spend maybe an hour filming those, maybe 2 hours. I do it in the afternoon after work, and then I post them, or somebody else posts them. So, and then I'll enter, like right now I have several videos that going viral. I have like 3 or 4 videos at the same time, all going viral, which is a lot. Like typically it doesn't work like that. I found a really good niche right now that's working really well that I'm really excited about. And then I'm like in the comments, like fighting with people or whatever, you know what I mean? So, and then,
and
and then so
and
that's
what I was gonna
that's how I
go ahead.
that's how I think through it. It's a little bit that's how I think through it. So it's, and then the reason, so people are like, well, why do you want more followers on Instagram? It's very simple. I'm a marketer. The more followers I have on Instagram, the more credibility I have without you even ever talking to me. It's very simple.
Yeah. And how do you make that business case for your personal brand? Obviously, it's easy to make the business case of investing in the podcast to get more views, to get more business there. And obviously there's going to be long-term value of having your personal brand. 100%. It's just like, how do you make the business case to invest more in that personal brand to like, I guess, gauge the worth in the long term to kind of like make it? How do you make that business case
It's
in your
very
head?
small. Like my cost on it is very small. Very, very small.
Got it.
I think I pay my son $500 a month. I think I pay the editors, a couple $1,000 a month. It's very small in the big scheme of things. So yeah, when our company it's an 8-figure company, you know what I mean? So it's like
Yep.
0.0001% of the total revenue of the company in my personal brand. So it's just something I know that eventually that's what's going to pay out to for everything. Like the more people know me and trust me and know that I know about marketing, the more
Mhm.
credibility it builds for everything else. But it is a long-term
So,
play. It's branding. So it's like short term, if you want to grow your company, it's run ads. But what happens when you stop running ads? Or what happens if the ads don't work anymore or whatever, right? So that's short term this month. Long term is branding. So branding is the most valuable thing you can do. The most valuable companies in the world, the most valuable thing in the world is no longer oil, it's attention, it's eyeballs. And you can do whatever you want with the attention when you own it. And some of the biggest companies in the world buy and sell your information. And so if you have that information, you can build whatever you want. And so I'm building for things that I may want to do 10, 20, 30 years down the road. You know what I mean?
yeah. So it sounds like just from a priority standpoint, it sounds like business, growing to how to find people pay you, then podcast, then prioritize that. And then after podcast, learning how to bring more customers to your business itself, then doing personal brand from a priority standpoint. Does that sound about right?
If it's your first business, yeah.
Yeah.
If you've been in business for a while and you've been doing it, then I may switch those around a little bit, but yeah.
Cool.
And I
That's super
wouldn't stress out
valuable.
about it. Don't stress out about it. It doesn't matter until somebody, and I want to be careful because if someone's like, well, I'm just starting, none of that matters. Just get somebody to buy something from you. That's all that matters.
Yeah, and that's super valuable. Well, cool, Gary. Thank you so much for all that knowledge. That was super valuable. We even talked a lot about business knowledge too. So thank you for that. That was super valuable because I know how difficult it is to balance podcast, business, and all that other stuff. But that's really amazing that you were able to make them together and make them super successful. So I love that.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and that's all we have time for today. Gary already put his information. We'll have it in the link below, so you can go follow Gary for more. And this is the Podcast Expansion Network, where we help people grow podcasts. And we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks, guys.